just how incredibly amazing it is to see so many people from our diocese passionate about children's and young people. It fills my heart with hope. I've been involved in youth and children's work for a long time. I was a youth worker for about 14 years and oversaw children's and youth work in the church, and then got ordained and bounced around the country a bit and landed in Nottingham. And now we lead Woven. Me and my wife here lead Woven, which is a church of churches northwest of Nottingham. And children and young people is a huge passion of ours here, and is a huge passion of mine, and always has been. And one of my questions to you at the very start of this, before we jump into a discipleship tool and start thinking, is, do you have faith that God can reach this generation? Because there's so much out there, isn't there? So much bad news put out about this generation of children, young people. It's lost, it's gone. The church has lost its way, can't reach this generation. So many times you kind of hear people almost giving up and almost telling us to give up. And the first thing I just would love us to do is say, maybe, just maybe, it's time to see God move in a really powerful way amongst this generation. Maybe this is the moment. Who knows what God has been stirring in the storm and the wilderness of this last year? And it's hit young people incredibly hard, hasn't it? But maybe something is stirring underneath that. Maybe there's a moment of gospel opportunity for me and for you. And so as you stop and think for a moment and think about the young people surrounding your church, the children and the young people, the families in your community, the people down the street from you right now, just imagine, maybe God's already at work, and maybe more is going on than we realized. And so tonight we're going to look at discipleship. If I could just give my top tip for being on a learning community, as Josh said, I've been playing with learning communities for quite a long time now, and engaged in learning communities. My top tip for all of you on being on a learning community is to be a magpie. So don't wait for the genius idea to just plop into your lap for you to take away, and that will sort out all of your children's youth work issues. You can just make it all happen because someone's given you a nice, neat package that you can go and take away. You've got to work for it. You've got to be a magpie. You've got to look around this room and think somewhere here is some people with some genius ideas, some thoughts, some thinking, a context maybe a little bit like mine. And maybe someone will say something at some point. It may not be one of the speakers. It may be in your breakout groups. It may be as people are sharing their thoughts. And if they say something, you think, that's really good, I need to find out more about it. Note down who they are and message them in the private chat. And say, I'd love to hear more about that. Could we get a Zoom call in separate to this? Could I find out more about how you're engaging with that? And go and be a magpie. Go and find the gold that's in this learning community, because I promise you there's gold. Every time I start one of these things, I think, goodness, will it work here? Is this going to happen? But every single time we do a learning community, absolute gold comes out, and it's usually not from the speakers, just to set your mind at rest. Usually it's actually from all of you guys. There's gold in you. So we're going to look at discipleship, and one of the things we do try and do in learning communities is not teach you a bunch of how to do youth work or children's work. We recognize that in every single one of our churches, there's a slightly different context that you're trying to engage with. So one of the things I always say is there's no off the peg, perfect solution that you should all just jolly well do and then we'll be fine. Your job is to contextualize what God is asking you to do. And so what we try and do is teach a bunch of tools to make you stop and think about your context. There's no right or wrong answer about how you go about it, but we want to ask some good questions. And as Josh said, this first tool is to help us think through what is right now. How are we engaging in discipleship right now? So why discipleship as that first tool? Well, there's lots of things that Jesus doesn't say, aren't there? I noticed that Jesus doesn't say go and start loads of youth clubs or do really brilliant assemblies, great as those are, or even go and do amazing church services. Jesus doesn't really mention terribly much about that kind of stuff. But the thing he does say in Matthew 28, 18 to 20 is, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. And I just think Jesus's commission would echo to us today. I think if he'd say one thing, I mean, his great commission was the one thing he wanted ringing in his disciples' ears. The one thing I think he'd want ringing in our ears is go and make disciples of children and young people and families. Church, that is our responsibility. These children and young people that are around wandering past our church buildings, often completely unaware of what's going on. I think Jesus would say, go and make disciples. But one of the things I was thinking about as I was preparing this thought was about what we measure as churches. I wonder what you measure about your young people, about your children's work, about your youth work. What do you measure? Most often what we measure is attendance at things, attendance at events, attendance at services, attendance at small groups, attendance. And the funny thing with that is attendance doesn't necessarily measure discipleship growth. It just measures attendance. There's ways in which we might be able to make that measure discipleship growth, but it just measures attendance. But you see, that's really important because what you measure is what you will celebrate, and what you celebrate is what you'll replicate. Let me just say that one more time because I think it's really important. What you measure is what you will celebrate, and what you celebrate is what you'll replicate. So if you, all a long way of saying, if you measure the wrong thing, you're going to replicate the wrong thing. And all too often as church, I think we measure the wrong thing. And we spend all our time measuring attendance and we miss measuring discipleship. Are we making disciples? And if that's Jesus's primary commission to us, we should probably work out how to measure it. So this first tool is all about how we take a little snapshot thinking about how we measure discipleship in our context. Being a disciple, very briefly, there's going to be more about this tomorrow, but being a disciple is very simply someone who's growing in their walk with Jesus. And so we need to think about how young people, kids and families in our communities are moving towards Jesus. Are they taking steps of growing towards Jesus? I'm going to share my screen. Well, actually, I'm going to try and share my iPad if I can. Hopefully, if this works, in a second you'll see my iPad. There we go. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see that? Just so okay, you can see it. So we created this tool to help us think through discipleship. And I draw it out as a road because it's a journey. You know, all of us would recognize that we're all on a discipleship journey. And actually, I want to challenge what we think of when we think of discipleship. Often what we think of discipleship-wise is actually quite a long way down that journey. But the journey of discipleship, I think, starts when we're really far off from Jesus, the very beginning of the discipleship journey. Now, you'll realize now that my drawing is worse than my 5-year-old's drawing. So apologies for that. That is genuinely the best person picture I can do. But that is a person at the very beginning of their journey of discipleship. You see, I think, and I would contend, that discipleship starts with those who are the furthest off from Jesus. Those children or those young people or those families that you think they have no idea about Jesus. You know, in Ephesians 2:12-13 says this: remember that at that time you were separate from Christ. Maybe think of all sorts of children, young people, families that are like that, separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel and foreigners to the covenants of the promise. And maybe we would say, look, actually, there's lots of children, youth and young people that we know that are complete foreigners to Jesus. They're complete foreigners to Jesus. They're not kind of engaging with church. They're not looking to any of our stuff. They're not coming to anything. But actually, I believe if we're going to make disciples, we've got to go to those foreigners from Jesus, those people who don't even know who he is at all. Young people who maybe no idea that Jesus is anything more than just a slight gentle swear word. One of the things I noticed about the way Jesus calls his disciples is that he goes to them. Do you notice that? Jesus goes to where his disciples were and calls them on. They have no concept about who he is. In some ways, they're complete foreigners to Jesus. They don't know. In fact, it takes them quite a long time to figure it out. What are we like? If I ask that question of you tonight, if we're really honest with ourselves, what are we like at going to meet the foreigners from Jesus? Those that really don't know, those that are furthest off. How many foreigners of Jesus do you know? How many youth do you know in your context that just have no idea, but you're starting to build that relationship? That you're making that contact, that you're going to where they are. Do we even know where they are? Do we know where the young people are hanging out, or the children are, or what the families are engaging in our communities and our context? Because actually, if we're going to make disciples of all people, of all children, of all young people, we've got to go to them. So that's the first question. How are you doing at that, if you're really honest? But also, we don't just want to go and meet some people who are completely foreign to the concept of following Jesus. We want to help them grow. We want to help them move from being complete foreigners to journey a little bit along the road to becoming fans of Jesus. You see, what happens when we go out and we go and meet some of these young people and get to know them is often they cease to become completely foreign to the idea of Jesus and thinking about God. And actually, they become like fans of Jesus. They've maybe not got on the bus yet. They're not ready to kind of pray a sinner's prayer or anything like that, but they're kind of open and warm to the concept. In Mark 1:21-22, you see something that happens all the time. But in this, it says, they went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue, began to teach. And it says in verse 22, the people were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority. You know, you see that so often, don't you? The people are amazed by Jesus. They're fans of Jesus. It doesn't necessarily mean they've got any further than that. We can, I think, notice when people that we're going to connect with, children, young people, families, move from being foreigners of Jesus to fans of Jesus, when they start saying things like, you know what, following Jesus seems to work for you. It's maybe not for me, but it really seems to do something for you. You know, actually, it's great. Or maybe they start saying, you know, would you just pray for this thing? It's not for me. It's not that I want to be a Christian. I can't pray myself, but would you pray for it? And you start to realize they're not completely foreign to the idea. They've kind of moved on that discipleship journey to being a fan of Jesus. But obviously, rightly so, we don't want to leave them there, do we? We don't want to leave a bunch of youth or children or families in a place of being just fans of Jesus. We want them to carry on that discipleship journey to become followers. My pictures of people are getting worse as I go on. Followers of Jesus. We want them to become followers of Jesus. In Acts 9:3-6, you hear the amazing story of when Paul has his conversion moment. It's like the scales fall from his eyes and he suddenly realizes who Jesus is. I've had the privilege in my life of seeing those moments happen for young people lots of times. That moment when they cease to be a fan standing on the edge and saying, well, it's good for you, but it doesn't matter to me, to becoming a follower of Jesus themselves. In fact, I wonder how good we are at giving people who have got that far as a fan. They've maybe started showing up to something you're doing, a youth club or a toddler group or something like that. Maybe they've come to something, but how good are we at taking them from being a fan? They met some Christians, they think your church is a nice thing and it's all good. From that to become real followers of Jesus, to be given the challenge of the gospel, to be asked what it will mean for them. You know, I've been consistently surprised how open children and youth are to the gospel of Jesus. Consistently surprised. I feel like I should cease to be surprised about it, but I've been consistently surprised how open they are to the good news. And in fact, one of the little mottos I try and say to myself all the time, because I feel like I need to believe it, is the good news is called good news because it is good news. Because actually, we want to, when we have people who come into our orbits, into our churches, into our things, if we don't actually give them the opportunity ever to respond to the good news of Jesus, then I believe we've missed a key discipleship opportunity. But equally, we don't want to leave them just as followers, do we? We want to take people, just, we don't just want to get them over the line of praying a sinner's prayer or sort of giving their lives or making some sort of commitment to Jesus. We want to take them further and deeper. We know there's a whole life of faith that we'd love to see young people, children growing into. We don't just want them to be followers of Jesus. We want them to grow to be friends of Jesus. We want them to grow to be friends of Jesus. We want to invest in them deeply. We want them to develop a real closeness of relationship. In John 15:15, Jesus says, I no longer call you servants. Bearing in mind, they've been following him for quite a long time. I no longer call you servants because a servant doesn't know his master's business. Instead, I've called you friends. Jesus' disciples got on that depth of relationship with him. They're drawn into a closeness with him. And actually, one of the things I would say is I've read, as I'm sure you have, with such sadness, the statistics of young people who grow up in church, go to kids' work, go to the youth work, go to university and quit. I mean, that's such a regular stat. I would say it's because we've left them as followers. We've not really taught them to be friends. We've not really taught them to really have that depth of deep relationship with Jesus for themselves, that earths and breathes in their lives. And so my question is again, how, in your, don't delete it, Rich. In your context, how good are you at moving followers to be friends, at helping young people and children get that depth of relationship with Jesus for themselves? And then there's one more step I just want to draw us into and challenge us that we can do, is we don't even want to leave children and youth just as friends of Jesus. We want them to get them to the point where they see themselves as family of Jesus. In Mark 3, Jesus says this, then he looked around at those seated in a circle around him and said, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and my sister and my mother. That depth of family. And the way I kind of think about this is those that are kind of in deep family relationship with Jesus end up engaging with the family business of Jesus. They live out his kingdom calling for their lives. They go and reach their friends. They start to pray for healing themselves. It's like one of the things I've noticed is that sometimes, often we can talk about, well, the children and youth, they're the future of the church, or even they're the church now if we're really advanced. But often I would say this, when children's and youth ministry is flourishing, they lead the church. They lead the church. The things I've noticed so many times is that the things that the children and the youth are stepping into become the things that the adults eventually catch up with. When we get that right, because they live out the full family relationship with Jesus, they do his kingdom business. The other day I was doing our PCC meeting at our church. Don't worry, this isn't a boring story. I know that's your first thought, but I was doing the PCC meeting in our church, and I said to my kids around our dinner table, I always do a devotion at the start. What should I teach the PCC? And Beatrice came up with this brilliant thought. She's how old is she? She's, oh dear me, she's 6, and she came up with this brilliant thought of Jesus calming the storm, and actually how coronavirus has felt like a storm, but we're learning through it, and Jesus teaches his disciples, and I was blown away. And so I shared this thought with our PCC, and I felt like it just framed our PCC, and I thought it was a really good example of a young child living out that full family relationship with Jesus, taking a significant lead in our church, actually leading our PCC for that evening. And so there's my question for you. How are we at building and making disciples? Are we good at connecting the dots, helping young people grow through these different stages? Now, let me just say one final thing, and then I promise I'll finish, Josh, and hand back to you. But one final thing. One of the big mistakes we make in children's and youth ministry is we build an outreach, which is quite good at doing this bit of the journey. There's like an outreach piece. It's like, well, we do a youth club and we do a kids outreach after school club and a thing in the school or something like that. And what we're really good at is we make foreigners become fans. But then there's never any way they can become followers. We never help them go that next bit. And then at the other end of the schedule, we have Sunday morning kids and youth work where we help friends become family. And those two things never join up. And so we wonder why it never grows. But actually, all we've done is we're really good at doing two little dots, and we're awful at this centerpiece. And those two worlds never collide. Whereas actually, when I think children's and youth ministry is healthy operating, there's always that sense when we're meeting someone right down this far end of the scale, right down the beginning of the journey, we know how they would get here. We know how they'd end up as family of Jesus. We know what that journey would look like, and we know what we can't make it all happen. It's God's Holy Spirit that does it. It's God's power that does it. But we know how we're going to invest, and we know how we're going to take them on that journey. So there's my challenge for us tonight. I'd love us to think about it. Josh is going to introduce how we're going to do about it, but I'd love you to think particularly how are we moving people along this journey? How are we moving people along this journey? And there'll be people who are brilliant at different bits of this journey. And so one of the magpie things we can do over this next bit of time is spot people who are brilliant at different bits of this discipleship journey to learn from them.